Hey, science fiction and fantasy authors, would you like to get more exposure for your books and get some support to uncover story ideas, enhance story cohesion, and get some ideas for marketing? Then sign up for my 30-minute story success clinic interview on my podcast, How to Write the Future. Every 30-minute story success clinic is recorded and gets aired as an episode of the How to Write the Future podcast. So sign up today. The link is in the show notes. And now let's get on with the show. Hi, everyone. Welcome to How to Write the Future podcast. I'm Beth Barany, your host. This podcast is for science fiction and fantasy writers who want to write positive, optimistic futures, because when we vision what is possible, we help make it so. Today, I am conducting a 30-minute story success clinic, and I have with me a fantasy writer. I'll let her introduce herself, Katie Willem. And Katie, is that going to be your writing name? I should confirm ahead of time.
Oh man, I don't know. I still haven't decided. My whole family knows me as Katie, and my friends know me as Katie, but I've also have like this professional Caitlin going on. So likely one or the other. It might be easy to find me either way.
Yeah. Well, we'll definitely circle back to that. How do you introduce yourself when you tell people you're a writer? What is your short writerly introduction?
Oh man, I don't know if it's short because it's more than 13 years now, but it's just this 13-year story of how I became a writer. So I grew up, born and raised in Alabama, and kind of grew up always dreaming about escape and living this fantastical life of adventure and heroism. And I have just a super active imagination, and was probably tagged that way because my elementary school teacher was like, "Oh, you're gonna be a writer one day." And so high compliments as a young kid. But I did the adventuring thing. I traipsed around the world. I garnered a lot of fun stories to tell, but I really found that one adventure was still waiting on me, and it could actually be found in the backyard of one of my childhood friends. Years ago, we created this imaginary world together called Lascar. We were sisters. We pushed into this unknown magical world, both as ourselves and as our characters, and we became heroes. She eventually moved from Alabama off to Albuquerque, New Mexico. So it was a little hard to play pretend together at that point, but we still shared the story and sent, different scenes back and forth to one another. But eventually I took it over fully and began writing what is now my first, and I have to note this, unpublished novel, Finding, book 1 of the Lascar series.
Fabulous. Well, I'm so glad that you're here so we can work together on your story success. And when I invited you in, you said that you wanted to talk about niche and tropes because it was the biggest stressor for you. And you're never sure of who would want to read your book or how to tell folks why they should read your book. And I just want to start by saying that this is a great thing to think about. This is a marketing question. And of course, it bleeds into editing as well, but you're already thinking about your readership. So we're really talking about marketing today, which is fabulous. And I guess I would start off by saying, let's talk niche. What do you mean by niche?
I think, in the realm of writing, there's a place where everybody kind of places, Harry Potter belongs here, Narnia belongs here, the Hunger Games, like all of those really high, high in popularity books, and they're pop cultural in a sense. And when I think about finding the niche that I belong, it's like, where do people put my book in contrast to these super popular series and fantasy novels that have, I mean, for years have been huge.
Mm-hmm. So it's so let's just step back and, you and I were in the umbrella of speculative fiction. That's the biggest umbrella, right? That encompasses science fiction, fantasy, weird fiction, anything with the fantastical elements, anything alternative present, alternative future, anything that isn't set in the contemporary world and isn't set in a past world where it looks like we think it looked like, and that's historical fiction. So we're in the world of speculative fiction. And then because your world goes from ordinary world or contemporary world that looks like this world, and then they go through a portal, right? Some kind of, I think your device is a book. Is that right?
Yeah. Yeah, a notebook.
A notebook, right. And then through that, there's some kind of magic teleportation into a completely different world, a kingdom, Lascar, completely different rules of society, where your protagonists play a key role and get to play in the world of the political affairs of the world and influence that world. Very different than the ordinary world, which is they're high school students, right?
Yeah, my main character is 17 when the book starts, and her sister's younger than her. So they're, they don't really have a voice. I mean, they can't even vote at this point. And to give a little bit more color, they get dropped into, not just political machinations, but they are dropped into rulership. Their parents are effectively like one of the ruling families of this world and have disappeared from what they know. And it's like, oh, I have this whole kingdom I have to take care of immediately because mom and dad don't know where they are, don't know if they're alive or dead. And it's interesting thinking about the adult tones that come out when I always have thought about my book being young adult, maybe even like closer to like children's fiction. I think it grew up with me, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like it. A lot of fiction for teens and even kids is when the adults are not around. And so back to niche. I've heard what you're doing and what Narnia is, and even what Harry Potter is, although that I'm not 100% sure if it's in that category, called portal fantasy, where there's a clear demarcation, like in Narnia, there is a clear demarcation. In Harry Potter, there is. These two worlds coexist. It's just that the Muggles don't know about the wizarding world. So that's not portal fantasy. That's something else. And now I would draw a bigger boundary and say, Narnia, Harry Potter, your story, their fantasy. That's the bigger realm. And then I would put your story into the niche of portal fantasy. What we're talking about here is like subgenres. So a reader might go into the library or into the bookstore and look for portal fantasy. So I would highly recommend to you and anybody listening that you do some research into portal fantasy and also look at other stories. Like, are there some contemporary stories that are doing portal fantasy? And are there some other words that readers are attaching to it? So go to the book reviews and see, are they calling it something else? And this is often how a new subgenre gets born, is because people start labeling it something. The readers do. So that's where I would put your book, and as a shorthand. And it's one of the things that you can use to invite people in. Hey, if you like portal fantasy about young people, set in a contemporary society, and then going into a fantastical society, now you could start talking about your fantastical society. And here's where we get into tropes. And I just want to let everybody know who's listening that Katie is one of my clients. So that's why I know a lot about her story and keep saying things about it. And so we've been working together for some time. And so I know a lot of the tropes that are already in your story. And what's interesting and what I'm noticing as a trend in marketing, and I'm marketing a lot on Twitter. So I see this on Twitter, but you could do it in any of the social media channels, where the writer will list out the niche, the tropes, all in this cute list, usually with emojis. And you read that list and you're enticed. You're like, ooh, I like this and I like that. And oh, what an interesting combination of tropes. So for the reader, let's define tropes. Tropes are generally, and maybe you have a definition too, Katie. I see tropes as elements of storytelling that float around in various kinds of stories, but then there are also kinds of tropes that you're only going to find in specific genres. Like there's certain tropes we're going to find in fantasy that make readers just squeal with delight. And then if you're in a different genre, you're going to find different tropes. So for example, I write in mystery, science fiction mystery, probably not going to have your protagonist stumble on a dead body in your book, right? Like in my story, I have an investigator, there's that scene with the dead body, somebody stumbled on it. And that's a trope inside of mystery. Inside of fantasy, there's a whole bunch of tropes that people love, absolutely love. So your job as the writer, and everyone listening, your job as the writer is to identify the tropes that are already in there. You love fantasy. You wrote fantasy. And I know there's a trope in your story that I think is very attractive. And it has to do with your fantasy world and what you built it upon.
I know what you're talking about here.
Do you want to share it with the class?
A little bit of a spoiler here if anybody's planning on, you can't find it, so maybe it'll, unless I just stand out here. But what's really interesting is I was a total nerd in college, and I took this class on Alexander the Great. And I was like, if you don't know this, nobody has found his body. Like historically, Alexander the Great was buried, moved, body disappeared. And I went, what if Alexander the Great was transported to this new world, healed by the magic, brought back to life, and conquered this new world? And, thousands of years later, his great-great-great-grand something, granddaughter, comes into the world to technically save it. That's the storyline there, in short. But that kind of historical retelling and reimagination was one of my not newer. I have been out of college for a very long time at this point, but it's just one of those ones where I brought it in and didn't see it coalescing until I really dug in. I was like, no, it makes sense that, this great conqueror way back when on Earth would be able to do the same. He was only 33 when he died. So it was just a fun little tidbit that I brought in.
Yeah. And I would like to say that this is a trope. So what if Alexander the Great was transported into a new land and conquered that land and started a new, basically had his second chance, right? A second chance at living, and maybe he lived a very long life. And so that trope to me of taking a historical figure and spinning it and doing a retelling. Retellings are huge, right? A lot of people are doing fairy tale retellings, and people have also done historical figure retellings. Well, what if actually, I read it was historical fiction, but it was about the first woman Pinkerton agent, because I'm fascinated, obviously, by that kind of thing. And so someone took what the historical documentation about her and wrote a story completely set in the 1850s and 60s and 70s, but imagined what her life could have been like from very scant historical data, because that's what she does. So what you're doing is you're bringing it into the fantasy realm. So I would say that one of your main tropes is an Alexander the Great retelling. What if he actually continued to live in this new land and had a very successful long reign?
I have an uncultured comparative to your reference, but I'm pretty sure there's a movie that supposes if Abraham Lincoln were a zombie fighter or a zombie slayer.
Yes. Yes, that's a great example. Right. And now we've taken a true historical figure and we've put him into a completely new situation. People love that. It's actually a pretty high concept, and it can really grab our imagination. So the other one that you have, the other trope, is hero as undiscovered royal. Right? There she is living her ordinary life in the ordinary world, being a high school student. She magically, for some unknown reason, gets transported into this new world. Boom. Well, she is a descendant of the king, you know. And even though she may not know at the beginning, because I don't think she does, the readers will be very attracted to that trope. It is a very, very common trope in fiction of all kinds. I mean, I just think of The Prince and the Pauper. I read a version of that when I was a kid by Frances Hodgson Burnett. I think I'm saying it wrong. Called The Lost Prince, which was such a lovely story. And so I would say the Lost Prince or the Lost Princess, right? That trope is so powerful in fantasy. So far now you have 2 tropes we've talked about. And I know you have some others because you have 2 sisters.
Yes. Yeah. So that, like, the family piece, I mean, they're 17 and 16 respectively. And it's so funny to think about because that's pretty much the age gap between me and one of my younger sisters. And so all of the bickering and just, back and forth of like a real sibling relationship that's not perfect and, that is more realistic to how siblings today, I mean, you can't have a perfect life. You're very lucky if you do. I doubt anybody in the world does, but yeah, having the sisters in the beginning of my book is really grounded, and it grounds my readers in, hey, like, this is normal life for Beth, my main character. Very funny. I named her long before I knew Beth in real life, but
I'm flattered anyway.
yes. It was almost as if I was telling the future.
That's cool.
Yeah. But Beth and then Sam as the younger sister, like, they're living life with their parents, they're going to school, they're doing family stuff, they're having arguments, they're breaking up with their boyfriends, and, all of the things that you expect in the drama of, 17 and 16-year-old, a high schooler's life, is there. And then all of a sudden, all of this shifts because their parents disappear on Earth while they are, waiting for them to come home. And then after that, it sets off this, movement towards the portal and towards Lascar, which they are clueless about. Neither of them knew about it until they landed there. So kind of silly that I always think, are kids, that gullible, or will they believe, to go into the forest? And I was like, it was a magic talking book. It, all the fantasy tropes, you have to have a little bit of belief in magic to read some fantasy books. So
absolutely.
Yeah.
And if you motivate it properly, making sure that the reader knows why your character chooses to follow or go into the forest or to even pay attention to such a magical object, you'll be fine. And that's another trope, magical talking book. The other trope I want to, you're talking so beautifully about is the sisters, like real relationship, between sisters, sibling rivalry, or you could call it like love-hate relationship. What you want to do in this list of tropes is give it a nice little characterization that feels unique, that doesn't feel super cliche. So sibling rivalry might feel cliche, but love, hate, pull your hair out relationship between sisters, right? Like, you see what I'm saying? Like, I'm adding a little personality to that. And so when you're marketing and you can list out these tropes and people will read them and be intrigued. And there might be some other tropes in there, like, and here's where I know less about your book as we got deeper into it. I mean, I've seen your summaries and stuff, but like, are there issues of learning how to trust yourself, learning how to step into power? Like, that's something I write about a lot in my books about women and young women, like learning how to be a leader, or learning how to trust, discovering you have magic, learning how to wield your magic. And that's akin to learning how to wield your power. So think about the inner arcs that your characters are going on, and is there one or two or even three in there that are really key to you, that you really care about? Those are the ones we can tell the readers.
It's not particularly a spoiler. Maybe it's more like a trigger warning. I will be very gentle with the subject here, but Beth lost a boyfriend in the beginning before the book starts. It's about a year out from losing a boyfriend who died by suicide. And, she's still struggling when the book starts. And I mean, you don't ever really get over that. You never really, lose that pain. It just lessens. And it really, at the beginning of the book, you just see a lot of like brittled anxiety and like pain that she's just holding on to. And throughout the book, especially this first book, it's all about kind of self-forgiveness and really like being able to lean into, the truth of the matter, which is it's not my fault. And I need to be able to trust myself with how I feel and what I think, or I'm not going to make it in this world. And it's literally life or death for her in some cases, because she's being chased down by, a man who's after her, the big bad. And I think further into the books, so I have kind of this grand plot of everything. And further into the books, it's much more about going from learning to trust yourself to go with your gut and do what's right. Because, not to like spoil anything, but she gets put into a lot of situations that are gray areas and just places where a normal person is not going to expect to be in. And somebody who grew up, for 17 years in the normal world, it's like, oh, you want me to fight in this war that is using swords? Who am I? Like, I'm up against these, soldiers, and it's really about, leaning into that. And, there is magic in this world. It's afforded to those royal families. That's kind of how royalty was defined in the book, is like the manifestation of magic powers in the heirs to the throne. And so, yeah, I think it's just her figuring out, self, and then moving into that. Now I'm going to help, like, use my own, like, sense of self to make a change and make the right decision and to make a difference in this world that, is needed.
Yeah, that's great. So, like the first book, if you're just marketing the first book, you might market it using terms like loss, overcoming loss, self-acceptance, self-compassion, things like that, right? And then in the future books, it might be more like stepping into doing what's right, or learning how to decide in moral gray areas. Like, these kind of little indicators will show readers that it's not just an adventure, which is awesome, but it's also a young woman growing into maturity. And I think for a lot of people who read the genre, they're actually in their 40s and their 50s and older. I found this out when I was marketing my young adult fantasy. Like, my core readership was a 45-year-old woman. And you may be surprised that you might have older readers who are reading for that younger self who wants to grow up in those ways. Like, there's still a part of us that is yearning for those adventures at that age that we didn't have.
Man, so healing the inner child. I love it.
Exactly. There you go. And we're all maturing at different rates, and all the different parts of us, right, are maturing at different rates. So to highlight that, I think, is attractive. And you can also test this. Like, we mentioned multiple tropes and niche, and then you can play with these different combinations and watch how people respond and play with it in the social medias. This is also going to shape your book cover and the longer book description, your author bio, right? Because you can create a nice little echo. In previous conversations, we've talked about the author branding statement, which I will link to in the show notes for everyone. So these themes are probably inherent to who you are and to your work, and will probably show up again and again. At least I've noticed now. I'm working on my 16th novel or something. I'm like, oh, I'm still dealing with the same issues that I dealt with before. They just have different flavors and variations. And it's very typical as authors. We get obsessed. We're naturally obsessed with certain themes and issues and concerns. As we start to wrap up, I want to know, are there any questions that you have for me? Did we address your concern about niche and tropes?
I think it's really helpful to have just a partner to throw ideas off of and point out, like, no, that's a good idea, because I will land on something and then go, scratch that, and just keep, spiraling into an idea, and then all of a sudden it's just a thousand words long and a little ridiculous. So yeah, this was super helpful.
Oh, I'm so glad. And because the podcast is about how to write the future, really the whole purpose is to support writers around how do we put our positive visions of humanity into our stories in a way that's compelling and interesting and readers really love. So it just occurred to me to ask you, in what way are you advocating for a certain positive change in society through your stories, like through illustrating something in your stories?
Oh, man. This is a good question. Oh, man.
Not to put you on the spot or anything. This was not a rehearsed question.
Yeah, no, I think about it a lot, because I think, not to be, holier than thou kind of person, because no, that's not who I am. But I think about every single time I go to make an action or go to do something, I'm like, what's the impact? Yeah, I have this intention to this, but what's the impact? And so I thought about it a lot with my book, and it's, instilling hope. I think we can go into a situation that is bleak and miserable, and, you don't see the end of the tunnel, but the end of the tunnel is going to come at some point, and it's just about being able to continue on and continuing to have hope for the end of the tunnel. It's always like a constant reach in my books, reach for something lighter, reach for something, more hopeful than what is around my characters and what is around my readers. Even if I made my reader cry because I have done something mean to one of their favorite characters, I'm not admitting that at all. But when I can show them that it's not the end, and, my characters can see it's not the end, and it's not final, and it's not something that's going to ruin everything. I really like that idea of hope.
Yeah, that's wonderful. I really love that. And when we're writing in the speculative fiction realm, science fiction, fantasy, we're imagining these very challenging situations like what you have in your story, and being able to even grasp hope in those situations. I think that's so wonderful. And you're right. It gives readers hope. That's wonderful. Mm-hmm. So where can people find out about you, Katie? If they want to keep track and follow your career and be there when your books get published?
Yeah, well, I do know I have a Twitter page that is dreadfully untweeted for a while, but it's Caitlin M. Willem, and it's at the Lascar series on Twitter. I also have my link to where my website is on there. So if anybody's curious, I think my prologue's still up on my website. If you want to take a read, or you can, I think, contact me there. I am looking for beta readers. So anybody who wants to know can reach out.
That's great. That's so wonderful. All of that information is in the show notes. So I really want to thank you, Katie, for joining me today in the Story Success Clinic, and I can't wait for your book to be published.
Me either. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Katie.
Write long and prosper. Science fiction and fantasy authors, sign up for your 30-minute Story Success Clinic and get more exposure for your books.